Kobus van der Wath is Group Managing Director of the Beijing Axis, and he's with us here in the studio. Well, Kobus, before we talk to you about China, about a year, just over a year ago, the Chinese representative to the United Nations had some pretty interesting words or pretty interesting points to make. Let's just replay a clip from what he told the UN.
What I want to tell you is that, are you the number one? Is it true that you have almost 50% of world military budget? And the China population is 6 times or 5 times that of the United States. Why blame China? No, forget it. It's high time to shut up. It's U.S.'s sovereign right to do whatever they deem good for them. But don't tell us what is good for China. Thank you very much.
Kobus, that was a diplomat from China. How are they feeling nowadays? As vociferous?
I think, let me qualify, not on behalf of China, but, I think just as a general opening comment, China has arrived from nowhere in the last 30 years, asserting itself diplomatically in terms of international political economy, in terms of economics, in terms of trade, investment, and so on and so forth. But a lot of things are still being learned. Diplomacy, international engagement, international acceptable, universally acceptable protocol is still being learned, and people do things in different ways. So that is a frustrated person speaking there. I'm not going to say more about that.
But are the Chinese frustrated with what they've seen happening? In many ways, in Davos this year, they were blaming the Americans for bringing the world economy to the brink, if not over it. And as a consequence of that, the whole Chinese program is now put under threat.
I think one can say in a word that they are. We've seen very recently the comments about, the teacher having now, got problems. Are we then, as all the students, supposed to follow the teacher's advice? So even in recent times, we've seen this frustration expressed. But the fact is that I think on the outside of China, we need to accept China is a rising power. It's the 3rd biggest economy in the world now. Diplomatically, China is likely to flex its muscle more and more. But also, I think, on the flip side, China needs to understand that, that it needs to, in a way, play by the rules. And these are soft skills, political, diplomatic skills, soft skills, that are still being learned. And I think, language, culture, systemic differences are all to blame in a way for this. Hopefully in 5-10 years we'll look back and see that this integration, which is inevitable on a cultural, political, economic level, is happening in an appropriate manner.
It's interesting that you mentioned that China is the 3rd biggest economy in the world. Pretty soon it'll be the 2nd biggest, because the latest GDP figures from the International Monetary Fund has got China at 4.2 trillion,
yes,
and we've got Japan at 4.8 trillion. Indeed. So they're getting close to each other. Of course, the US is 3 times the size of those two. But it is also interesting, whatever matrix you look at, China has managed its economy a whole lot better than the US and other countries. And I get back to perhaps the reason why we wanted some input from you here this evening, coming out from Beijing to tell us, how is it going in China? Is the Chinese miracle stalling?
Well, I think, I always start by saying in 2007 we had 13% growth. We had 6.8% growth in the 4th quarter of last year, full year 9%. So that is a marked slowdown. Much of that was positive before the Olympics, I can say, part of a cyclical slowdown. But much of it was also the external shock of what happened in September, October last year, as the global economy was almost suffering a pinprick, if I can put it like that. So you need to we need to understand that growing at 13% is not healthy, it's not desirable, it's not sustainable. Growing at a 6 to 8% range is, but the question is it sustainable? Currently, the economy is probably in a 5 to 7% range of growth, and we are concerned. Everyone is concerned about what that spells for social cohesion.
In Davos this year, the president of China, Mr. Wen, was saying that because of the injection into the economy of around about 6 to 8% of GDP that they're going to be putting into infrastructure program, he had no problem in confidently forecasting 8% economic growth in China. Was he talking his own book?
Well, that was actually Premier Wen, not President Wen. And he's actually reiterated those comments more recently, that he thinks that around the 8% level is attainable. If we look at statistics in January, February and March, then it looks as if it could be a bit of a stretch to get to that this quarter and next quarter, the sort of the 2nd quarter that we're in now for a few days in April. But I think, and that's consistent with our own forecast as well, is that we're looking for a significant rebound in the 3rd and 4th quarter this year. The extent to which that could then make up for the softer first half is still an open question.
What's the mood like on the streets of Beijing?
Well, interesting. We've seen the buoyant times of the last 4 or 5 years, and within the context of 30 years of strong growth. But then, of course, things unraveling significantly late last year. Stock market deep down on the year to December, despite, of course, the strong rally we've seen so far this year. And we've seen property prices down to late last year.
What are people like?
Right
Are they optimistic or pessimistic?
Right now, you're seeing a bit of a revival in the mood. So compared to even December last year, I think the news, the bit of propaganda that you see around monetary and fiscal stimulus and the rebound in some pockets of property prices, very minimal still at this stage, but some, and certainly the healthy rally in Shenzhen and Shanghai have helped the mood on the ground. And of course, Beijing has the one thing: it has a relatively healthy structural economy at this stage. It can effectively afford a lot of this pump priming, plus the fact that it has a lever in Beijing. When it plans a stimulus, it can implement it, and it can do so immediately and relatively effectively.
One of the
that
benefits
helps.
of being an autocratic government system. Mr. Shapiro, a good friend of mine was out here for the National Yearling Sales. He trains racehorses in Hong Kong, David Ferraris. And he was, we didn't get to chat for too long, but he said to me, there's no shortage of money in Hong Kong. There's still lots of people wanting to buy racehorses. So I guess on the luxury end, although perhaps the volume, Kobus, might have fallen away, there's still there's so many people in China with money that it isn't collapsing anytime soon.
And also for the global mood, look at the outbound capital flow that we're seeing in Australia in particular, with very large deals at the moment. Certainly in Africa, in the resources sector, a lot of appetite, and also in other parts, South America. We've seen some deals announced in Canada in energy. We've seen some just this last few days announced in logistics in the United States. So that is also important, I think, and of course the fact that medium to long term, China will continue to be a very important player for demand of all kinds of basic materials.
So they're still importing South African minerals.
Importantly doing so, yes.